we can just have the event ourselves.
I think we need our fearless leader. Oh, here he is.
Oh my God.
Are you back? Okay, great.
And I think we're actually live. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. Sadly, still wrapped in a pandemic. Talk about globalization and mobility. The virus has been in fast forward motion and continues to iterate as long as we don't tamp it down with global vaccination. So getting vaccination mobile is a key to all the other questions we face in this program. If we can't have functional society and economy, it's going to be hard to tackle climate change or anything else. I'm a little rushed because I had some technical glitches. Andy Revkin, Columbia Climate School, today here to talk about mobility, which is can either be enhanced or will happen regardless as people deal with the fluxes that are happening on the planet, both climatic and biological and everything else. And I've got a wonderful array of guests here today. Khanna, particularly, whose book called Move, it launched recently. And hold on a second, I will share a slide, and hopefully I won't disappear from the screen. My camera is doing. Maybe I'll stay like this. You'll see me in Svalbard in the Arctic, but I'm here. So this is Andy Revkin again. And Parag, and we also have today, Abram Lustgarten from ProPublica, former colleague of mine when I worked there, who's dove into the climate migration beat over the last couple of years, is writing a book about human mobility, forced and otherwise, in America going forward. And Purana Tiropkar, who's a Columbia University sustainability management grad student. It's really great to have you here too, Purana. And we're going to talk about these questions. First, let's just dive in on the book. And if anyone can't hear me, just let me know. I'll just kind of be here as that kind of avatar. Parag, can you describe your own background? What got you to be who you are so far?
I guess there's a long and a short answer. First of all, thank you, Andy, for inviting me on. And it's, again, an honor and a privilege to be able to join with Abram and Prana for this conversation. It obviously becomes more and more timely by the day. I guess formally I'm a political scientist, but I would describe myself much more as just a migrant and a traveler. Always have been, always will be. It's my life story in a way. But the sort of subject field, if I had to pick a discipline that I most identify with and feel most comfortable with, is geography. And all of my books in some way, shape, or form are deeply connected to various aspects of geography. And what I've been doing over the years is addressing various layers of geography in my work. So the geopolitics of great power relations across various continental scales, or looking at the functional geography of infrastructure, which is what my book Connectography was about. What are the layers of infrastructure that we build, and how do they relate to geoeconomics and geopolitical competition? And this book, Move, is very explicitly, as I say on page 1, is about human geography, the distribution, the composition of humanity around the world, right? 8 billion of us now, maybe 9 billion in the future. Where are we going to be over the next 10, 20, 30 years? So, it's great. Thank you so much for bringing up these slides. We can just click through a couple of them. This is a pixelated map. There's 8 billion pixels. It's the present distribution of the human population. Wherever you may be, you are on this map. And I'll just say as a background, I find it very, in all of my cartographic work, I find it very sad and ironic that we don't raise our children to look at maps like this. The map of the world that children see from the time they're born through their schooling years, and the maps that hang in our offices and classrooms all over the world are maps of political geography, right? We inculcate, we literally raise children all over the planet to view the world as divided by political boundaries. We don't actually show them this map. This is the map we should be showing kids from the day they're born until the day they die. This is where we are, human geography. It matters fundamentally. And we've settled into certain patterns of geography, human geography, based, of course, on climate change, to say nothing, of course, of politics and other factors.
Sure.
But this is going to change dramatically in the decades ahead. So if you click ahead, one slide, you'll see this animation coming in. And this, as everyone is now familiar, the map of the suitability index, right? What happens as global temperatures rise and other climate chain reactions kick in. What happens to the livability versus the unlivability of places. And red doesn't mean you cannot survive there. Red means it's decreasingly suitable for human life. And green means more suitable. Now, I would challenge anyone to come up with a statement of a more sort of perverse phenomenon in the world today, a more perverse reality afflicting our planet, our society, than this. The fact that the green areas that are becoming more livable over time, and we should obviously put a little asterisk around that, more livable does not mean not vulnerable to very extreme climate effects, which are obviously very global in nature. But on a relative basis, places that are better suited for human survival, versus the fact that the majority of the human population, and particularly 100% of the future population, which is today's young people, most of the world's young people live in red zones.
Right.
And this is our world. This is our human civilization right now. This incredible distortion and misalignment of the geography of people versus the geography of livable habitats. And this is a perversion of political geography and many other accumulated legacies, if you will, of the way in which we organize and structure our geographies. And I believe that it is our great civilizational challenge today to realign our geographies, the geography of people, the geography of resources, the geography of borders, and the geography of infrastructure and economics are misaligned and need to be realigned. And there is no summit that is talking about this, because at COP26, you talk about climate mitigation. We can go to the next couple slides. COP26, we talk about mitigation. And of course, we need Manhattan projects for climate mitigation. We need to decarbonize industries. We need large-scale, renewable energy generation. We may even need to do various kinds of geoengineering. And we put 95% of our total climate-related spending into that, and only 5% into adaptation, which is helping human beings right now, wherever they may be in this time of need, as climate change is already affecting billions of people. And climate adaptation has not gotten enough attention. I think, Andy, you follow the COP process very closely. And I know that we're both heartened by the fact that the closing statements said, well, we need to put 50% of future spending into adaptation related investments. And, I applaud that. I pray that a fraction of that actually gets delivered. But the agenda is huge, and we don't even categorize and enumerate the climate adaptation steps that are needed very well. And when sovereign governments come together, the one aspect of climate adaptation that they'll never talk about, because of the very nature of what sovereignty is migration, right? Is large-scale population resettlement. But we are mammals imbued with a fight or flight instinct. And the surest path to climate adaptation is the one that humans are most capable of doing, which is to physically move,
Right.
But you will never, ever hear about it at a level, because again, say it as a political scientist, sovereignty, the last vestige of sovereignty that remains in this world, where a government cannot control what pathogens are flowing across borders, terrorists, cyber hacks, you name it, you don't have full monetary sovereignty even. But the one vestige of sovereignty left in this world is controlling your borders against the movement of people, right? And so you're not going to have a multilateralism is conventionally and contemporarily practiced and defined, is not going to solve this problem. So population resettlement is the big topic there. And again, a shout out to Abram, who's absolutely leads the world at this point in reporting and documenting this everywhere. I've been reading you before I was writing this book, or as I was writing this book, you started doing your pioneering series. And I just saw sort of kindred spirit in what you're reporting, because we just don't talk about this at the scale that we have to talk about it. So if you next slide, just a couple of points here. I've been looking at the history of human mobility and migration on a large scale and noticing a couple of things. First of all, with each passing century, the decimal point in the number of people who cross borders, the decimal point moves to the right. We've gone from millions of people migrating to tens of millions in the 19th century, hundreds of millions of people in the 20th century, and in this century, probably 1 billion plus people who will migrate, who will relocate in some way, shape, or form. That's lesson number one. We are clearly increasing the volume of human mobility and migration as a response to many stimuli. That's number one. Number two is the components of those drivers. In previous centuries, it's economics or it's politics. It's famine or it's war. Now, all of a sudden, in this century, the number or proportion of total migrants driven by climate-related factors, with again a little sub-asterisk that climate and politics and economics obviously tie together very intimately, and it's very hard to disentangle them. Think about the Syrian civil war and the role of drought and so forth, and that applied everywhere. But already climate is a major force in migration, and it's going to be probably the dominant one in the years ahead. So what does this add up to? Well, over the centuries, more and more people move and migrate and relocate. The role of climate in that is increasing as well. And we're not doing enough about it at the same time in our politics. That's where we are right now. Next slide, I'll get into a bit around climate, migration. And this is sort of my small contributions building on what Abram has already done, to look at what the specific geographies and patterns of climate-related migration are going to be. We've done some pieces on this for Nat Geo and the Financial Times, and kind of looking at, this is where I get into the realignment of the world population based upon the demographic reality of a numerical plateau that we are reaching in the world population, as well as our human instinct to move from coastal to inland areas, from low-lying to higher elevation, from south to north. These are kind of the three vectors, if you will, that you can generically claim will characterize, climate-related movement. Next slide.
1 second.
And I think that's it. Oh yeah. So, what I do in this particular book is to kind of go around the world and look at the propitious geographies. You could call them climate oases. Again, big asterisk. There is no climate oasis, right? And I initially set out to more confidently portray geographies that can and will, absorb large and growing populations, and they will on a relative basis. However, there is no truly stable place, and any place can suffer the tragedy of the commons as more people move there. And so I came to the conclusion that this was not a book about a movement from one place to another, but about mobility and almost a new nomadism that will afflict large swaths of the human population. So a constant movement. But that said, on a relative basis, I profile certain geographies, whether it's the Great Lakes region, whether it is Eastern Anatolia, whether it's Russia, various parts of Russia. It's so big, obviously, Japan. And I look at how they are adapting to these phenomenon and what their future demographics might look like, and so on and so forth. And this is just one adapted map there. I think there's just one more map.
Hold on a second.
So this is just a restatement of what I said earlier. I'm fundamentally, looking at the civilizational project of realigning geographies. There's a misalignment of the geography of people, old and young, and based upon climate suitability versus not climate suitability. There's a misalignment of the geography of economic activity and industry versus where human labor is located, a misalignment of where our political boundaries are versus where people need to be, in which societies actually need to import people because of their gap between old and young. And this is, to me, we don't ever plot these things on one map. We have maps of politics, maps of people, maps of infrastructure, maps of resources. The reality of human planetary civilization is that it's all of these layers at the same time. It's a complex layering of geographies in the plural, and there is no supranational force, there is no alien being that is going to tell us and coach us in how to realign these geographies. And because we don't visualize them well, we don't even grasp the deep nature of the problem. And it's my commitment, as someone who studies geographies, obsessed with these geographies, to visualize how and where they operate and how we can realign them. And that's basically what, I want people to be attuned to as we move forward, and hopefully in a collective way. So I think there's maybe just one more slide, where I talk about the agenda, and I conclude the book by saying, there's only two things you can really do if you want to help humanity as our numbers plateau and even decline. You either move people to where there are resources, or you move technologies to people to help them survive. It is like as simple as, if you want to oversimplify, right? It's as simple as that. Move people to resources, or technologies to people. And moving technologies to people often is not good enough, just to be clear. And moving people to resources has to be done responsibly and sustainably. Otherwise, you have the tragedy of the commons. So skipping to the bottom, I say, look, what is this new model of civilization, which I call 3.0? It's really about enabling mobility and fluidity of populations to survivable areas, but to do so in a sustainable fashion through adaptive investments and new kinds of infrastructure and so forth. And that's what, I'm advocating. So, I obviously, as you move through the book, I move from just kind of analytical to normative. I'm advocating for a certain way of thinking about human geography in the future. And I don't see, but there are, just a final point. I mean, the book is based on 4 scenarios, and only one of the scenarios is positive. I don't have a whole lot of faith in humanity as politically constructed right now, right? There's a scenario called the New Middle Ages, barbarians at the gate, regional fortresses. And the 4th and final scenario is Northern Lights, and that's the one that enables, in which we talk about more recirculation. But in a way, that's sort of where I think we are. But much more interested now in hearing your responses to that. Thank you.
Oh, this is a great start, and it's so much fun being here from Svalbard, looking through a porthole in a ship. Notes. My Logitech camera. Hey, Logitech, let's figure this out. There's so many stimulating ideas you just presented, and I know we're going to get to Abram's writing and his thoughts too. But Khanna, as the person who will inherit most of this century, compared to the three of us, what's your initial take on this? You're not. Where were you born? You've been mobile also, and does this feel? Which of those scenarios sound pretty like everything is relative against progress? So, what's your reaction?
It's terrifying. So when I saw that map, I'm from India. I'm from Mumbai originally, and that map on India was entirely red. So I'm like, okay, where do I go from here? And I mean, following up on that, right? A couple of questions, honestly. And before I dive into the questions, firstly, thank you so much, Parag, for advocating for some critical topics. And starting today, I will identify myself as an Asian instead of an Indian. So that was really nice. My question to you, honestly, is, for me, it's a privilege to be able to, move from one country or city to another because of various reasons. But what about others for whom this is not accessible, right? How do we go from advocating for being mobile to actually taking action on it? And what does it even mean to, take this to life? Because we know the solutions right now, but we don't know how to get those solutions to life.
This is a great question. I'll also say, it struck me a lot in researching this, that I was writing more and more about Asian populations. Obviously, the previous book was all about Asian demographics and economics, but here too, because the majority of young people in the world are also Asian, and as Andy rightly teed it up, the younger generation, the millennials, the Gen Z and Gen Alpha, are the largest 3 generations in history. But it also goes down from here, because actually Gen Alpha will probably be smaller than Gen Z once its birth period is sort of completed. So I focus a lot on the world's young people, because you are the present and the future. And of the world's young people, the majority are, of course, Asian. And the Indian population in particular, and the South Asian population in general, already represents 1.8 billion people, so far larger than the number of Chinese in China. And I myself, I was born in India too, and have fortunately been able to migrate around the world. But I found myself focusing more and more on the future geography of South Asians. 1.8 billion, primarily young people who currently are residing in areas that are completely red, as you pointed out on that map. What becomes of them? And I started to realize that the South Asian diaspora, largest diaspora in the world, as a result of climate and many, many other factors. You could account for this strictly on the basis of politics and lacking economic opportunity. But when you bring in climate change on top of that, it is, much more significant. And now, to answer your question, because we don't have a global answer, it becomes these new vectors. And to me, the most interesting geographical kind of phenomena or migratory phenomena that emerged from my research was that these entirely new vectors of human migration are taking place and will accelerate that we have never witnessed before. In the past 75 years, and particularly the last 30 years, we've settled into these patterns where we think about Latin Americans move to North America, Africans move within Africa, and they're trying to move to Europe more and more, and so on. These pairs of migrations that are relatively stable, right? People in the former Soviet Union staying in the former Soviet republics. But the two particular vectors that I focus on in the book that have never occurred before are South and East Asians moving way north into Central Asia and Russia, and B, South and East Asians moving west across Eurasia to Europe. So I talk about the rise of this phenomenon of Asian Europeans. Now, I grew up as an Asian American in New York, and it was like, a typical hyphenated thing. And there's 25 million Asian Americans. Kamala Harris is an Asian American. But there's only 4 million Asian Europeans, even though they share the same megacontinent. They're increasingly trading with each other and building infrastructure to each other. And Europe has the most significant labor shortages in the world. So what you're actually starting to see happen is large numbers of Asians migrating westward. And I give examples of that in the book, especially in Germany. And I predict that you're going to have way more even Asian Americans. And that's something we've literally never seen before at this scale. And then the other is South Asians moving northward into the Central Asian republics and Russia. And I directly report on that because I spent a lot of time in those former Soviet republics, especially Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so on. And I've literally firsthand witnessed, seen, talked to, people who are there, and you see this ability, this kind of South Asian trait of assimilation, especially given the various skills, sort of matches and English language adaptability. English matters less, obviously, in Kazakhstan. But the point is that you're seeing Indian doctors and farmers and construction workers, all over these geographies that I've been traveling to for more than 20 years. And they're starting to fit in, and they're becoming permanent residents in these countries. So the new ethnoscapes, the new ethnographic landscapes of these countries look very, very different in the future. So I'll end on this line, but I think the chapter on Kazakhstan in the book is titled "Kazakhstan has 20 million people. Is it ready for 200 million?" And that could be where we're headed.
It's such an interesting landscape, literally. To me, it's like a plumbing system too. When you bring in the question of the pull part and the push part, let's focus on the United States a little bit. And you have predicted Michigan as a hot spot or a cool spot on a heating planet. But here's Abram, one of the most recent pieces this was a while back, but you're doing like an extended rest of your life series, perhaps, on these questions. But this one on the new climate map showing migration around the United States was particularly interesting. So Abram, just a little quick sense of your reaction so far, and then we'll talk about the U.S.
Yeah, thank you, both of you, and for your kind words about my work, Parag, as well. And yours is just an extraordinary contribution. I would just add exclamation points to everything said. I think we're, the conversation, the framing of the situation that the world's looking at, I think, has been put very much in sync with my view of what's happening. These maps that you're showing right now, Andy, I think are an evolution of some of the same data, that habitability, suitability niche. And we took the data from some of the researchers, including Martin Scheffers in Germany, and extrapolated it with their help to match what happens in North America. And it shows that shift of, that sort of human climate niche, the place where people have thrived historically, moving north towards the Canadian border. And this, what you're scrolling through now, this is data from the Rhodium Group and Climate Impact Lab that is directly correlated with conditions that drive migration. So a little less theoretical, a little more solidly based empirical evidence of the sorts of conditions that in the maps show will be getting worse, but which broader research suggests will also drive a movement of people. And so, the series of reporting and stories that I've done did take a global approach, and also, looked, for example, at what's happening in Russia and North Asia. But the book that I'm working on now is focusing just on what these changes in this movement means for the United States. And so, I saw you started with that image of Parag speaking in Michigan, which is fascinating. Right. I just returned from Michigan last week, reporting on the same thing and trying to get a sense of, preparedness, basically. And so, I guess what I would add to the framing, that we've heard so far is that, there's going to be enormous challenges in how this movement unfolds, or how the pressures associated with the desire to move unfold. And what I think that comes down to, which we haven't talked about so much, is really this question of sort of fairness and equity. So we have billions of people on this planet that will likely seek to move, because there will be economic and climate and environmental draws, and economic and climate and environmental displacement from the places that they are. And we heard a little bit about how borders and sovereignty affects the sort of resistance to that movement. But the fact is, there's also, so not only the political resistance to that movement, but the financial barriers to that movement. So mobility is largely, a reflection of means of people who have the wealth to to move. And whether that's Floridians moving to Michigan or Guatemalans moving to Texas, they're sort of measures of the same thing. And so part of the story is about the people and the populations that are going to be trapped where they are, and what they will endure, which in the United States probably means that they will first endure, not only a deterioration of their environment, but a lack of investment in their environment. So, declining communities that start to lose their tax base, the quality of their schools decline as more people move, their infrastructure, which already is not being invested in quickly enough, is left to age even more rapidly, and over time those things begin to break down, and the people who are either too poor or maybe too old or too resistant to the idea of migration find themselves in these environments of deteriorating quality. And the opposing opportunity is, of course, to move in search of an environment that we think will be better suited or present more opportunity. And one of the pressures that will determine whether that can be a successful move or not in a place like Michigan, I think comes down to preparedness. And I think the first slide we saw was about adaptation, but adaptation, in this sense, it comes down to some real sort of nuts and bolts things that are not new. It's urban planning. We can anticipate an extraordinary growth in urban areas or in secondary cities, a shift out of rural areas where people are responsible for themselves, and into communities where there is some public and political support for whether it's infrastructure or economic support or healthcare, and that will draw people into cities. And those cities will need to prepare for that growth, or we'll see greater gulfs between rich and poor, employed and unemployed, served and underserved. Look at for example, Detroit's difficulty in providing something as simple as clean water to its residents now, and imagine whether that city or others like it are capable of making the investments and making them quickly enough to support, hundreds of thousands of people more moving into those environments. And I think that that's going to be the real sort of friction and challenge going forward. And it becomes, in the United States especially, very interwoven with historical and systemic racism as well. And you look at the way that urban planning is tied to, the redlining of communities, and go back to the 1930s, and the way that the redlining has translated to, through many, many links, basically poor economic conditions and less economic opportunity for people of color. And those, like we saw through COVID, will be the sort of divisions that are exacerbated extraordinarily and amplified going forward with future urbanization and migration, unless they're very intently and specifically targeted as things that need to be changed and considered as a part of that urban planning and that preparation process. And so I guess I'm with Parag in, if I had to guess, that the outcome, I see more grim opportunities for grim outcomes than I do for positive ones, because it's hard to see politically here or politically globally leaders taking the initiative and taking it quickly enough to do the sort of things that are pretty clear now need to be done.
I tend to favor your point of view as well, although I do see this. Parag mentioned early on the role of, well, you mentioned technology as a modulator of risk, but it's not just technology. I had Christy Ebai on here during the epic Pacific Northwest heat wave. She was under the dome in Seattle, and she's one of the leading researchers on climate and health. And we were talking about extreme heat. And she made the very clear point that social cohesion within a community means no one has to die in a heat wave. Even she pointed in the conversation to areas of the world that are already theoretically too hot to live in, where we live. And also she and others, Diana Liberman on the show from the University of Arizona, talked about the unbelievably uneven landscape within virtually every community of vulnerability. In other words, the drivers of forcing us to move or not move. Quite often, the wealth we have enables us to either stay where we are and just turn up the air conditioning because we favor that environment for other reasons, or as you were saying earlier, to move. So it does, to me, the folks who are forced to move are, as you were kind of implying, Abram, the least resilient, the least prosperous, the most prejudiced against people around us. And they end up, although this gets to another issue I've written about too, which is most migration so far has been within countries, which Abram is focusing on in the United States. But even the IPCC reports, there's an overstated vision, I think, of the world, everyone at the borders, because we have a very telegenic border in the United States with Mexico, and so we pay a lot of attention to it. But most of the movement that's happening is within countries. So I'm just kind of giving a little bit of pushback in a couple of ways, and I wanted to get your senses of this. And also the data show, and I wrote that piece that I showed a minute ago, that for flooding and heat, we're actually moving into people are moving into areas of hazard faster than the hazards are changing through climate change. That piece on flooding really gets at that. And that takes me back to the writing I did in New Orleans after Katrina, where the historian Pierce Lewis spoke of places like New Orleans as he put it, it's places that are impossible but inevitable. And they're impossible and inevitable because of geography, history. The mouth of the Mississippi will be inhabited, whether it's on a floating city or not.
But Americans our culture and our policies have kind of warped our logical response to the kind of pressures that I think around the world people are more free to organically respond to naturally. So we've subsidized our insurance policies and our insurance availability heavily to make the consequences of living in places like Florida or moving to places like Florida well after we understand the rate and the potential for sea level rise seem rational and seem like a good and safe investment and a safe way to plan your for your future assets. And the same thing with moving to, to heat, to places like Phoenix. We've subsidized not only the insurance in places that are dangerous, but the availability of water in places where we don't have it. And you add that to this sort of romantic notion, I think, that Americans have, of sort of believing in their own, or both attraction to the coast and attraction to sunshine, but also, sort of believing in, their own ability to craft their destiny despite the influences of the environment around them. And that makes us all, in terms of the patterns we're talking about, I think, illogical.
Yeah.
So yes,
I'm showing a visual that gets at this.
We've just moved in the wrong direction.
In the Build Back Better and infrastructure bills, as you were saying earlier, these institutionalized barriers to an equitable boost to capacity to be resilient, or to be resilient in place, or to move somewhere, even the capacity to get the aid is biased toward the rich, the billionaires for beaches. Billionaires get the money because they have lawyers and people who can apply for the money. So Parag, how does that sense, when you think about the global geography too, maybe this just tips you back toward that sense of this is not going to be easy, but the inequity part is huge, it seems.
Right. So, I want to be clear about the vast geographical differences in this, because we don't have a global answer. You don't actually teleport people from Bolivia to Russia, right? So in some ways you have a reinforcement of a couple of things. First of all, Andy, as you very rightly pointed out, most migration is domestic and remains so. Even climate displacement is still largely a domestic phenomenon. There is obviously a lot of evidence of it becoming, cross-border, but even that, again, is geo-specific. So will we, and this is, again, Abram has already documented this very thoroughly, and it's the very arresting reporting that you've done, the Central American populations moving northward, and recirculation of people within South America, these are discrete phenomenon, right? So there's those two geographies right there, different patterns, different generalizations, different numbers that we're talking about, different drivers. Africans within Africa. So, when you look at those climate models, you can see that, well, there are parts of Central Africa and parts of, Eastern and Western coastal Africa that, still look climate, resilient. And so you'll have, movements of Africans to those geographies and a reclustering and so forth. Then you have, European populations, Southern Europe to Northern Europe, obviously, because Southern European places are quite affected. You saw the Greek, forest fires in Greece, for example, and so on. But even within wealthy European countries, look at the German flooding, right? Germans will also move away from those widening floodplains and so on. And then there's, one of the geographies I focus on is Eastern Anatolia, where it abuts Arab countries and Iran. I say, look, the Eastern Anatolia, Eastern Turkey, is the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the cradle of civilization, as we learn in, fourth grade history class. And actually, Turks have moved away from that region and moved westward and left empty. I've traveled many times to this region. Really, one of some of those verdant, beautiful, agriculturally fertile landscapes in the world are devoid of people because Turks have moved away. But just to the south, across these flimsy borders, though there's definitely more barbed wire fencing than there used to be, you have Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Right, to say nothing of the countries further south as well, Jordan and Lebanon and elsewhere. You've got, well over 100 million people in severely climate stressed countries. And here you have, just over this one narrow, flimsy border, some of the most livable space in the world. Now, you tell me with a straight face that even with Erdogan as prime minister, and one day he won't be, but you tell me that 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, this area is not going to be populated by Arabs and Persians, because it will be, no matter what border is there today. Mm-hmm. And that is the grand story of human geography. It is ever changing in response to climate conditions, and supply and demand do, in a way, find a way to a new equilibrium despite the political obstacles. Otherwise, we would not be where we are. So you can focus on this week and Erdogan saying he's going to weaponize migrants and this kind of thing, which is a tragedy in and of itself. And we can spend hours on that. But you can also see the bigger picture, which is that one way or the other, painfully, violently, or gradually and tactically, you are going to have Arabs and Persians living in Eastern Anatolia. Yes, it is a fact, right? It is a ironclad, money back guarantee projection around human geography, because we are mammals, right? And mammals are going to behave in. So it will happen. So that includes, therefore, many poor, vulnerable populations. We're talking about some of the poorest people in the world, some of the most unequal societies in the world, some of the most authoritarian countries in the world. They're vulnerable populations, hundreds of millions of them, will be in some way, shape, or form, you could say, the beneficiary, or at least they will survive, right, at a minimum, through this migration process. It's not going to be politically expedient. It's going to be awful and ugly. We're talking about some of the worst governments in the world that are either the origin or the destination countries, right? This is not a pretty picture, but it's better than dying in place, right? Because that's literally what these people are faced with in these countries. So what I'm trying to advocate for, with a more political hat on, is how can this be viewed as a good, beneficial thing? How can you convince countries that they should absorb more people? Because all of this is happening in the broader context of this great demographic irony of the wealthy, aging, depopulating countries of the North, needing more people at the same time.
Right.
And one by one, I'm hoping that countries realize that they should be seeking to attract young people as much as possible. So you bring up the Japan thing. Japan is definitely one of my case studies, as is Germany and Canada, where I say,
Sure.
actually, some of the same countries that we've thought of as being only granting birthright citizenship, are places that, if not citizenship, though in Germany now, that if you look at the new coalition government, it's incredibly progressive around immigration reform and citizenship reform. But yes, Japan, more foreigners are living in Japan than ever. And just 2 weeks ago, the Japanese government again passed another pretty radical reform around the permanent residency rights for migrant populations. You never would have thought that a Nepali construction worker, right, in Japan would be granted like permanent residency. But now you've got Nepalis and Bangladeshis and Indians and Chinese and all sorts of, Filipinos and Vietnamese in Japan who are becoming permanent residents in Japan. What I do in the book actually is to kind of map out the journey, a hypothetical journey of a Filipino nurse in Japan.
Right.
She originally goes there to care for an elderly family, but of course that elderly couple eventually passes away. Then they become a maid in a middle-class Japanese household, but that family, that couple doesn't have kids because Japanese aren't having kids. But then the expat family that you're pointing to right here, right, they're giving away homes to foreigners now, and there's a whole banking system in Japan that's around the kind of rehabilitation of vacant property. And Japan has the highest vacant property stock in the world. And so they're basically going to subsidize foreigners to come and live in these abandoned towns, and they'll be bringing in their kids, and that Filipino nurse winds up becoming a nanny in one of those homes. And there you have it, a Filipino who initially thought she was going to go to Japan for 6 months or a year, winds up. That's actually how human migration works. Like, in Germany, we have this term Gastarbeiter, for the guest workers from Turkey who came in the 50s. Guess what? There's 5 million descendants of the Turkish, temporary Gastarbeiter. There's nothing temporary. About these new patterns of human geography, whether the driver is economics or climate. It's permanent.
Well, that feels like a very positive data point. I had written about aspects of Japan's demographic challenge, and in 2007, one of my first pieces on my blog at the New York Times was about, there was a demographer, Joe Shami, who led me the idea of, we're in a world of imploders and exploders, and that's the plumbing system problem, and how do you facilitate that motion? But it sounds like you're saying even in Japan, where there's such long resistance to the inflow, they're turning the spigot a little bit. That's really encouraging, I think. Khanna, I wanted to ask you about how this relates to how young people are learning and being educated now. Like, what's the toolkit you crave? Think of a world this dynamic as you think about the education system, including at Columbia, which is kind of like stuck in discipline and the like.
you know exactly how I feel about that. But yeah, I think I think one major thing that we are missing out of this is those who can't afford it. This seems very idealistic to me. What happens to countries, like, do we leave them high and dry? Like, what happens to those who are out there in the pictures that you just showed, or the blogs, the background of those blogs, right? Like, what happens to a farmer who can't afford it? Those are people who are going to be really hit by it, by climate change. And I crave toolkits to help those people who are going to be hit by that, because people who can afford to migrate are probably those who will survive. But what happens to those who can't make it or who won't make it?
Good
That's
question.
one big opportunity. Yeah, thank you.
Abram, what's your thinking? Think about
Yeah.
the Japan part, even how that relates to the U.S. landscape of emptiness and fullness.
Yeah, complex layered thoughts on that. I mean, the Japan scenario that Prague is laying out sounds optimistic to me, and wonderful that that's happening there. And I think something similar is poised to happen in Canada, which has recognized that their kind of economic future and expansion depends on allowing a greater, degree of in-migration, and they've begun to do that politically. But you don't see that same sort of willingness in Russia, for example, which I wrote about, which I think has both incredible need for more people because their population is aging and sparse for their land area as it is, but also recognizes extraordinary opportunity to benefit from some of the climatic changes that they'll see, particularly expanding agricultural land, but yet has just this deep-seated, prejudice towards outsiders, and particularly, other ethnic groups. And so that's the kind of, friction I think it's going to be difficult to, or conflictual to eventually, resolve those kinds of differences. And I'm afraid you see that, in the United States as well, where our collective prejudice for outsiders will, for a long time, trump our self-interest, economic self-interest in, growing our population or having the labor forces that we want to expand certain industries and take advantage of those economic opportunities. To Purana's question about, what happens to the people who can't afford, this is, there's no really good diplomatic way to put this, but my view is, a climate changed future is a horribly unequal, future for the world. So there will not be, large scale, larger groups of winners. There's going to be winners and losers. And, there can be in the shorter term policies, multinational policies, global policies, domestic policies, which kind of blunt that blow, make that transition a little bit easier on, some of those less privileged communities. Those things can help, but they will not erase that fundamental inequality. And I think that unfortunately, there's large groups of people on this planet that are destined, for extraordinary suffering. In the shorter term, and some of the work that that I did over the last couple of years, attempting to understand the migration from Central America, or the push factors from Central America towards the United States, tried to predict what some of those flows would be and what kind of policies would change them. And one of the outcomes from the modeling that I did with researchers at the City University of New York and Baruch College, basically found that, what we might call progressive policies towards Central American countries would help ease that burden, so foreign aid, investments by USAID, for example, or multinational institutions in farm communities, in water infrastructure, in urban growth in Guatemala would both improve the quality of life there for Guatemalans, also reduce the rate of population growth, because population growth and reproduction is associated with poverty, but also reduce the flow of migration, which I think is a short-term, kind of political goal. And that's the kind, that's one example of one possible fate for, a positive, outcome for the people who don't have the means to move and be mobile. But But the darker side of that is what you see already happening in places like Guatemala, in which the modeling that I was describing, suggests is going to be more common, whether it's in Detroit or in Guatemala City. And that's that as people move, and like you said, they'll move domestically first. There's a preference to stay close to home. There's an ease of not crossing borders. But you just get this extraordinary difference between rich and poor. And Guatemala City, for example, is one of the fastest growing cities in Central America. And its city center is becoming, both more dense and also wealthier. And the large numbers of people that are moving there from the rural lands, from farmlands that don't have enough water and other environmental change factors, are settling in slums on the outskirts of the city. And you're seeing these, surrounding rings, this sort of sprawl of slums. And, people I talk to suggest that you'll see the same thing around cities like Atlanta, which have considerably growing slums as the inner city is developed and gentrified, but larger numbers of people move to Atlanta and places like it, seeking economic opportunity or fleeing the lack of opportunity in the places that they come from. And so they get sort of relegated to the least served, underserved communities, and sometimes communities with no infrastructure, no clean water, no sanitation. And so that's a version of what happens to people who can't afford to move, or who can barely afford to move, but are sort of trapped and can't claw out of that hole. And, the worst version is people who simply can't move at all. And in the United States, and this is all about degrees, right? I mean, what happens in the United States is really different than what's going to happen in sub-Saharan Africa. But when you look at that in the United States, when we have an opportunity and are in cases starting to exercise that opportunity to use policy to move people, you're seeing that in terms of the revision of the National Flood Insurance Program and buyouts of coastal homes. You're seeing it in the relocation of a couple of small communities in Alaska away from coastline. You're seeing it in southern Louisiana, where the flooded coastline is subsiding and seeding into the Gulf of Mexico. None of those are on a large enough scale to make much of a difference yet, but they're kind of models for what can happen. And when you have a community which is full of people who can't afford to move or won't move, they can be, with their consent, hopefully moved by taxpayer dollars, which can pick people up and put them in someplace safer. And there's conversations that I'm starting to see form around, should you move communities as a whole so that they remain intact as social networks and communities in their new location? Could you have, northern communities become sister brother communities with southern communities, say a Michigan town and a southern Louisiana coastal town, where they might, have an exchange program or pair up to sort of, be teammates in that regard. So there's opportunities to do that, to kind of lessen the downside, the impact on on those quote unquote trapped communities.
Right.
But the downside, I think inevitably there will be communities that are trapped in the United States and elsewhere who just don't get out as the conditions around them devolve. It's
a tough challenge. I want to close out with, and I don't know if do you have a hard stop, Parag, or you?
Sort of, kind of. By a few more minutes.
Okay. Some colleagues at Columbia are working on this Model International Mobility Convention, and I'm thinking, if there was a way to level the landscape, ultimately, what are the things, tools, factors? This also feels pretty pie in the sky to me. But if we have a global currency, I'm pretty weirded out on Bitcoin. But is there an extra governmental possibility? Oh, and the last thing I'm going to throw in here, and Parag, you could just respond a little bit, is if we can succeed in redefining national security. Something I've written about and done sessions on here before, where you're thinking about investing in sub-Saharan Africa as a fundamental driver of stability that can reduce the plumbing pressure. It just seems like that could be a path forward too. But those are pretty grand ideas.
Sure. Yeah, well, a couple of responses. One is on the Model International Mobility Convention. So, we have had a progressive evolution in terms of, sort of most recently a covenant on safe, orderly migration and so forth. But these are normative, they're aspirational, they're non-binding. They contain stronger and stronger and more progressive language. But again, without enforcement capacity, it doesn't really amount to much. And you
Right.
have a lot of leakage, in that. But I think, it's better to have them than not to have them, of course. But you can't really hold countries' feet to the fire. Similarly, for an International Mobility Convention, as I said, sovereign governments do not subject. This is not an area where sovereignty will erode, other than in the Schengen Agreement within the European Union, which is a very particular case. But you do have free mobility of people within Southeast Asia, for example. That's labor mobility for professionals. So these things are quite narrowly circumscribed. So, I just don't think it's going to evolve at a global level very far, other than, again, normatively. Functionally, it's going to remain very much regional. I'll also say that, when it comes to, let me take two principal geographies just for my closing comments. One is India and Indians within India. You're going to start to see, because you're having more 0-day water events, in places like what happened in Chennai recently, you could see a recirculation of the Indian population towards less water stress, more water abundant areas, more fertile areas, places that people have been migrating away from, which is to say northern India towards southern India, a recirculation there. So it will become perhaps the biggest example of a domestic internal climate migration in the world will be Indians within India. And that's going to be step one. And I think we'll be reporting a lot more on that. And another example is just going back to Russia and the broader Central Eurasian, Eastern Eurasian geography. What I don't want to hold constant is the political mentality. I do agree, of course, that identity and culture shift very, very slowly. So you're not going to see Russians acting like Canadians anytime soon in terms of their political orientation, either their regime type or their outlook vis-a-vis migration. Canadians, as is well documented, go and fill hockey stadiums to celebrate new citizens. That ain't going to happen in Russia anytime soon. But there's a big difference between Vladimir Putin and his xenophobic nationalist populism and what happens on the ground. And this is like 20 years that I've spent, going around the former Soviet republics and Siberia and so forth. And when I wrote about this a bit more in the Nat Geo piece recently. When I am in Eastern Russian cities, what I hear is not Putinism. What I hear is, we've got Chinese infrastructure projects and we need more construction workers. We've got all of this, a farmland. We're the largest wheat exporter in the world as of this year, Russia is. We need more farmers. We need more food processing plants and facilities, and we need workers in that area. We want to revive these old industrial towns and have economic diversification. We need more workers. And that's what I hear. And I hear university administrators saying, in order to get more Asian students to fill our classrooms, we should start teaching in English. Now, not one of those things came out of the mouth of Vladimir Putin, but all of it came out of the mouths of the people who actually run Russia. They actually run and govern and manage and administer the largest country in the world, this enormous swath of depopulated geography. It's their job to actually make the country work. And all of the people who I've ever talked to, whose actual job it is to make that country function, not just to plunder its wealth into offshore bank accounts, right? The people who actually need to run that place actually sound a lot like Canadians, believe it or not. So please open the space, as we posit the future, to change in how we govern specific geographies, if not the regime in that country, which we cannot do anything about. But we can help those local places, forces, people, to get them the people they need in a way that is, commensurate with the political constraints that they face. And that will be our incremental contribution towards helping to make this, a better world for those people that would otherwise be stuck in place.
Well, let's see if this works for at least 30 seconds. I'll pop back on. Thank you again, all of you, for being here today. Purana Tiradkar from Columbia University, graduate student in sustainability and management, managing for plasticity, managing with these dimensions is a challenge, but an opportunity too. we didn't even talk about Parag's consultancy, which is more focused on the prosperity part. How do you build markets in these arenas as well? Maybe for another day. And Abram Lustgarten, my buddy from ProPublica, you guys are doing amazing work, and good luck with the book as well. Thank you for being on here again. Abram was on whenever that was, in COVID time, when your migration package came out. This is Andy Revkin at the Columbia University Climate School. So I'm in Lenape territory in the Hudson Valley today, as most days. Everyone out there, this gets archived right away, so share it with friends, colleagues, and let's keep the discussion going. I'll be writing about this on my revkin.bulletin.com platform as well. Thanks to all you. Good luck with the book, Parag, too.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andy.